For about 3 weeks this spring, one of the most important shipping lanes on the entire planet effectively stopped functioning, and the ripple effects of that closure reached far beyond the Middle East itself, touching fuel prices, shipping insurance, and supply chains on nearly every continent. Insurance rates spiked, tankers sat idle, and a genuine share of the world's oil and gas supply simply couldn't move, because Iran had closed the Strait of Hormuz and appeared fully prepared to keep it closed indefinitely, betting that the resulting global pressure would eventually work in its favor. Then, on March 19th, the United States launched a dedicated military campaign with one specific, narrow objective: tearing apart the exact naval and missile infrastructure Iran was using to enforce that closure, a campaign that would go on to be studied closely for how precisely it targeted the right assets in the right sequence. Let's walk through exactly how Iran shut down the strait in the first place, exactly how the American military went about systematically dismantling that blockade, and why the story didn't actually end there. Because what happened in the months that followed turned out to be far stranger and far more complicated than a simple, clean military victory. A story that stretches from targeted assassinations and bunker buster strikes all the way through to a role reversal nobody would have predicted back in March. If you want the full, accurate account instead of just the headline, stick with this one all the way through. If it's useful, go ahead and subscribe, drop a comment with your take once we get through it, and let's get into it. It's worth setting expectations honestly right at the start, because this is one of those stories where the dramatic headline captures something real and significant, but only tells about half of what actually happened. There genuinely was a moment when the American military executed a precise, coordinated campaign that broke the specific infrastructure Iran had built to close the strait. What the headline leaves out is everything that happened afterward, because the fight over control of this single waterway didn't end there. It kept evolving, reversing, and escalating for months in ways that genuinely complicate any simple story about the blockade being shattered once and for all. To understand why Iran's blockade of the strait carried such enormous global weight, you first have to understand exactly what was actually at stake in that single stretch of water. Before this war began, the Strait of Hormuz carried roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade, and about a fifth of all the liquefied natural gas moved by sea anywhere on the planet. That's not a regional choke point. That's one of a small handful of waterways whose closure genuinely threatens to destabilize the global economy within days rather than months. To put that scale in perspective, there simply isn't a viable, fast alternative route capable of absorbing that volume of energy trade if Hormuz stops functioning entirely. Pipelines running overland from the Gulf states can handle a meaningful fraction of the affected volume, and some countries had spent years building exactly this kind of redundancy, specifically in anticipation of a crisis like this one. But nothing close to the full quarter of global seaborne oil trade that normally transits, the strait can simply reroute overnight. That's precisely why a relatively narrow, geographically confined body of water became such an outsized flashpoint in a war that, on paper, was primarily about Iran's nuclear program and its broader regional military posture, rather than about shipping lanes specifically. So, when Israel and the United States launched their opening strikes against Iran on February 28th, killing Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, along with a number of other senior officials, and destroying a wide range of military and government targets, Iran's retaliation didn't just involve missile and drone strikes against Israel, American bases, and countries allied with Washington across the Middle East. Iran also moved immediately to close the Strait of Hormuz entirely, and it backed that closure with real, tangible force, rather than simply issuing a warning and hoping the world would comply. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps enforced that closure through exactly the kind of layered, asymmetric tactics Iran had spent years preparing for precisely this scenario. IRGC forces issued formal warnings forbidding any passage through the strait. They boarded and attacked merchant vessels attempting to transit anyway, and they laid naval mines throughout the waterway, transforming what had been one of the world's busiest and most heavily trafficked shipping corridors into something closer to an active minefield overnight. The effect on global shipping was immediate and severe. Major shipping firms suspended their own operations in the strait entirely rather than risk their vessels and crews, a decision that rippled outward into disrupted flights across the Middle East, rerouted global trade, and a level of economic disruption that went well beyond the immediate military confrontation between Iran, the United States, and Israel. Iran's approach here reflected a deliberate strategic logic that's worth understanding on its own terms, because it wasn't simply chaotic retaliation. Closing Hormuz gave Tehran genuine leverage in a conflict where it was clearly outmatched militarily on almost every other front. If Iran couldn't realistically defeat the United States and Israel through direct confrontation, it could still inflict enormous economic pain on the entire world by choking off a meaningful share of global energy supply, betting that the resulting pressure from oil-dependent nations, allies and adversaries of the United States alike, might eventually force some kind of negotiated resolution more favorable to Iran than continuing to absorb direct military strikes. That's a genuinely rational, if extraordinarily costly and dangerous, strategic calculation, and it explains why Iran committed so heavily to the mining and harassment campaign rather than simply accepting the strait would remain open throughout the conflict. There's a useful historical parallel worth drawing here too, because Iran threatening to close Hormuz isn't a new idea born out of this specific war. It's a strategic threat Iranian officials have raised repeatedly across decades of tension with the United States and its regional allies, going back through multiple prior confrontations, without Iran ever previously following through on it at this scale. What made this particular episode different wasn't the threat itself. It was the willingness to actually execute it, laying real mines, attacking real vessels, and sustaining that closure for weeks, rather than treating it as purely rhetorical leverage. That shift from threat to action reflects just how much the calculus had changed once Iran was already absorbing direct strikes that had killed its own supreme leader, a level of provocation that arguably removed whatever restraint had kept the strait open through every previous crisis. The American response took shape over the following weeks, and it's worth understanding the sequencing here because it reflects a genuinely deliberate military campaign rather than a single dramatic strike. On March 19th, the United States formally began what would come to be known as the Strait of Hormuz campaign, a sustained aerial operation specifically targeting the Iranian naval vessels and drones responsible for enforcing the blockade. This wasn't framed as a broad, open-ended bombing campaign against Iran generally. It was announced specifically as part of a plan to reopen the strait to international shipping by systematically destroying the exact assets Iran was using to keep it closed. That kind of narrow, mission-specific framing matters because it tells you the American military had identified a clear, defined objective: restoring freedom of navigation through one of the world's most critical waterways rather than pursuing open-ended regime change or unlimited escalation from the outset. Part of that campaign involved a strike that's genuinely worth highlighting on its own because it illustrates just how precisely targeted this operation actually was. Israel carried out the assassination of Alireza Tangsiri, the specific naval officer who had been overseeing Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a random strike against a general command target. That's a deliberate decapitation strike, aimed squarely at the individual actually responsible for coordinating the mining and harassment campaign choking off the strait. Removing the officer directly overseeing that operation would have created real, immediate disruption to Iran's command and control over its blockade forces, exactly the kind of targeted disruption that can meaningfully degrade an adversary's ability to sustain a complex, coordinated maritime operation, even without destroying every individual asset involved. That kind of decapitation strike reflects a broader pattern that's shown up repeatedly across this entire war, targeting the specific individuals responsible for coordinating a threat rather than relying purely on destroying equipment and hardware. A minefield or coastal missile battery can eventually be rebuilt or replaced given enough time and resources, but the specific operational knowledge, command relationships, and coordination experience held by a single senior officer overseeing a complex campaign like this one is far harder to simply replace on short notice. Removing Tangsiri specifically, rather than simply continuing to strike physical assets alone, reflects an understanding that modern military campaigns often depend as much on the people directing them as on the hardware itself, and that disrupting command structures can produce cascading effects on an adversary's ability to coordinate follow-on operations that pure equipment losses alone might not achieve nearly as quickly. The physical campaign against Iran's blockade infrastructure ran in parallel with that decapitation strike, and it centered on a specific, coordinated operation that became known as Operation Project Freedom. As part of that operation, American forces dropped 5,000-pound bunker buster bombs on hardened Iranian anti-ship cruise missile sites positioned along the strait, the exact kind of coastal missile infrastructure Iran had built specifically to threaten commercial and military shipping transiting the waterway. Those coastal sites represented a genuinely serious threat on their own, hardened, dispersed missile positions capable of striking vessels from concealed locations along Iran's coastline, and systematically destroying them, removed one of the two core pillars of Iran's blockade strategy. The other pillar, naval mines, got addressed just as directly. American forces sank 16 separate Iranian mine layers, while those vessels were actively engaged in laying mines throughout the strait, a strike timed specifically to catch Iran's mining operation in the act, rather than simply destroying static mine stockpiles sitting in port. That timing matters enormously, because it meant American forces weren't just degrading Iran's future mining capacity. They were actively interrupting an ongoing live mining operation before additional mines could actually get placed and begin threatening passing vessels. It's worth pausing to appreciate just how comprehensive that specific combination of strikes actually was as a piece of military strategy. Iran's blockade rested on essentially three legs: coastal anti-ship missiles capable of striking vessels from land, naval mines scattered throughout the waterway itself, and a functioning command structure capable of coordinating both of those threats in real time. The American campaign hit all three simultaneously: bunker busters against the hardened missile sites, direct strikes against the mine-laying vessels themselves, and a targeted assassination against the officer coordinating the whole operation. That's not an accident of timing. That reflects genuinely careful military planning aimed at collapsing an adversary's entire blockade architecture, rather than picking off individual assets one at a time and hoping the cumulative effect eventually adds up to something meaningful. By early March, even before this specific campaign had fully run its course, President Trump was already declaring victory in fairly sweeping terms. On March 9th, he stated publicly that the war was, in his words, very complete, pretty much, claiming that the Iranian military had been destroyed and that the Strait of Hormuz had been reopened. He went further, expressing genuine interest in the idea of the United States actually seizing control of the waterway from Iran outright. A remarkably ambitious statement that went well beyond simply restoring freedom of navigation and towards something closer to permanent American control over one of the world's most strategically vital choke points. It's worth treating that specific claim with real skepticism, though, because declaring a war very complete, pretty much, while a dedicated military campaign against the underlying blockade infrastructure was still actively running, is exactly the kind of premature victory announcement that tends not to hold up cleanly once the actual fighting continues. And in this specific case, it didn't hold up cleanly at all. There's a useful pattern worth naming here too, because premature victory declarations have shown up repeatedly across this entire war, not just in this specific instance. Throughout this conflict, moments of genuine, confirmed military success have repeatedly gotten paired with sweeping public statements suggesting the underlying conflict itself was essentially resolved, only for renewed fighting to break out again within weeks. That pattern matters for how you should read any dramatic claim of victory in this war going forward. A real, verified tactical success, like the specific operations that dismantled Iran's original blockade infrastructure, doesn't automatically translate into the broader, strategic resolution that accompanying rhetoric often implies. And treating those two things as interchangeable has proven, again and again throughout this specific conflict, to be a genuinely unreliable way of predicting what actually happens next. What actually followed over the subsequent months was a genuinely messy, prolonged, back-and-forth struggle over control of the Strait, one that never really produced the clean, permanent resolution. Trump's March 9th statement implied was already achieved. On April 23rd, Trump ordered the U.S. Navy to destroy any Iranian boats caught laying mines in Hormuz, a directive that only makes sense if Iran was still actively attempting to mine the strait, more than a month after the original campaign to eliminate exactly that threat had supposedly succeeded. That's a genuinely important detail, because it tells you the Operation Project Freedom strikes, however effective they were in the moment, didn't permanently eliminate Iran's capacity or willingness to keep contesting control of the waterway. Then came a genuinely remarkable role reversal that's worth understanding in real detail, because it complicates any simple narrative about the United States straightforwardly shattering Iran's blockade once and for all. On April 13th, following the collapse of a round of diplomatic talks held in Islamabad aimed at ending the war, the United States itself imposed a naval blockade, not against passage through the strait broadly, but specifically against Iranian ports, coasts, and Iranian-flagged shipping. In other words, the exact same country that had spent weeks destroying Iran's blockade infrastructure now stood up its own blockade, aimed specifically at choking off Iran's own maritime trade and cutting off the regime's access to seaborne commerce entirely. Under that blockade, which ran from April 13th through late May, American forces seized 3 ships outright and intercepted 85 vessels, according to CENTCOM's own figures, though Lloyd's List, an independent shipping industry publication, separately estimated that 26 vessels managed to bypass the blockade entirely during that same window. A discrepancy between official and independent figures that's worth noting on its own as a reminder that, even confirmed, ongoing military operations rarely get reported with perfect consistency across every source tracking them. American officials claim the blockade was costing Iran roughly $500 million a day in lost trade, a genuinely staggering figure if accurate, reflecting just how thoroughly Iran's economy depends on being able to move goods and energy exports through its own coastal waters, a dependence that made the American blockade an unusually potent form of economic leverage regardless of how the underlying military balance of the war continued to shift. Iran didn't simply absorb that pressure passively either. It retaliated by seizing 2 cargo ships of its own, a reminder that even during a period when American naval power was clearly dominant in the region, Iran retained at least some capacity to strike back directly against commercial shipping. That role reversal deserves closer scrutiny because it raises a genuinely interesting question about what the actual American strategic objective in this whole episode had become by mid-April. The original March campaign was explicitly framed around restoring freedom of navigation, opening the strait back up for the entire world's shipping, not just for vessels friendly to American interests. The April blockade pursued something quite different, actively restricting Iran's own maritime trade specifically, using naval power not to guarantee open seas for everyone, but to apply direct economic pressure on a single adversary. Those are two genuinely distinct strategic goals, and the shift from one to the other reflects how quickly the underlying purpose of American naval dominance in the region evolved once the immediate crisis over the strait's closure had technically been resolved, moving from a defensive, restorative mission towards something closer to an offensive economic weapon, aimed squarely at forcing Iran back to the negotiating table on American terms. That blockade eventually got lifted on June 18th as part of a broader memorandum of understanding both countries reached that month, an agreement explicitly designed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz on a more durable, negotiated basis and formally bring the war to a close. For a brief window, it genuinely looked like this entire saga, Iran's initial closure of the strait, the American campaign to break that blockade, and then the American blockade of Iran that followed, might actually be winding towards some kind of stable, mutually accepted resolution. It didn't hold. By July 7th, Trump was telling reporters he considered the truce over, and while he initially suggested the following day that renewed exchanges of fire wouldn't necessarily lead to long-term military action, the conflict escalated considerably in the days that followed anyway. By mid-July, the situation had deteriorated badly enough that the United States moved to reimpose its own blockade against Iranian ports and shipping, less than a month after that same blockade had been lifted as part of the June ceasefire agreement. CENTCOM's announcement reimposing the blockade came with a specific and genuinely unusual detail attached. Trump posted that the United States would be reimbursed 20% of the value of all cargo shipped, an arrangement that reads less like a traditional wartime blockade and more like an attempt to extract direct economic tribute from any commercial shipping still willing to risk transiting the region. The blockade notice itself specified that neutral vessels engaged in transit passage to or from non-Iranian destinations wouldn't be impeded, though they remained subject to the right of visit and search to confirm they weren't carrying contraband or attempting to breach the blockade on Iran's behalf, and ships that failed to comply were warned they could face destructive or disabling fire from American forces enforcing the blockade. That enforcement wasn't merely theoretical, and it's worth being honest about the human cost that came with it, because this is where the story stops being a clean tale of American military dominance and becomes something considerably more complicated. During the earlier blockade period, before its June lifting, American forces disabled 9 ships that CENTCOM said had failed to obey the blockade's terms. One of those incidents carried a genuinely tragic cost. 3 Indian crew members were killed aboard the tanker MT Settebello when CENTCOM forces disabled the vessel on June 9th. That's a detail worth sitting with directly rather than glossing over, because it means the blockade enforcement campaign, however strategically justified in the context of an active war, produced real civilian casualties among sailors from a country that had no direct stake in the underlying conflict between the United States and Iran, a pattern that echoes exactly the kind of collateral human cost that's shown up repeatedly across other threads of this broader war as well. That specific incident is worth dwelling on a little longer, because it captures something genuinely important about how blockade enforcement actually works in practice rather than in theory. A blockade notice can specify, as this one did, that vessels failing to comply may face destructive or disabling fire, language that sounds precise and controlled on paper. In practice, disabling a moving vessel at sea, particularly one that may not be fully complying with warnings, for reasons having nothing to do with hostile intent, confusion, communication failures, or simple bad luck in exactly where a disabling strike lands, carries real risk to the people aboard, regardless of how carefully the strike itself is aimed. The deaths of those 3 Indian crew members aboard the Settebello weren't the result of Iran's war against the United States, in any direct sense. They were the direct result of enforcement actions taken by the American military against a vessel that had, by CENTCOM's own account, failed to comply with blockade terms. A sobering reminder that even the enforcing side's own operations in a conflict like this one can produce exactly the kind of civilian casualties that get attributed, when discussed at all, to the vague and impersonal language of blockade compliance rather than to a specific named human cost. The situation has continued evolving in the weeks since, and it's worth bringing the timeline all the way up to the most recent developments to understand where things actually stand. By early August, reporting indicated Trump was actively seeking some kind of exit from the broader war, even as violence continued spreading across the wider Middle East region. On August 11th, American forces fired on a vessel in the Gulf of Oman, specifically to enforce the ongoing blockade of Iranian ports, confirming that the blockade enforcement campaign remained an active, live operation rather than a settled, static policy. That same day, reporting emerged that Trump had used what was described as an elaborate ruse to fly out of Turkey following a summit there, specifically because of a perceived threat tied to Iran, a genuinely striking detail suggesting real, ongoing concern about direct threats to American leadership, even months into this drawn-out conflict. And separately, reporting indicated Trump had begun pivoting back towards sanctions as a primary tool against Iran, as other strategies for actually ending the war appeared to be losing momentum. So let's actually answer the question this title poses directly, because the honest answer is genuinely more nuanced than a simple, clean victory narrative would suggest. Did the United States military shatter Iran's Hormuz blockade? In the narrow, specific sense of the original crisis, yes, unambiguously. The dedicated campaign launched on March 19th, combining the targeted killing of Iran's blockade commander, precision bunker buster strikes against hardened coastal missile sites, and the direct destruction of 16 Iranian mine layers caught in the act of actually mining the strait, represented a genuinely comprehensive, well-executed military operation that systematically dismantled the specific infrastructure Iran had built to enforce its initial closure of the waterway. That's real, confirmed, effective military action, not propaganda or exaggeration, and it deserves to be recognized clearly as exactly that. But the broader story of control over the Strait of Hormuz turned out to be far messier and far less permanently resolved than Trump's early March declaration suggested. Iran kept attempting to lay mines even after Project Freedom supposedly eliminated that threat, prompting fresh American orders in late April to keep destroying any vessels caught doing so. The United States itself ended up running not one but two separate blockades of its own against Iranian shipping, a role reversal that complicates any simple story about America restoring open, unrestricted freedom of navigation to the region. Those American blockades produced real, documented civilian casualties among neutral third country sailors, exactly the kind of human cost that tends to get lost in triumphant headlines about military campaigns succeeding. And, as recently as this past week, American forces were still firing on vessels in the Gulf of Oman to enforce blockade terms that have now been imposed, lifted, and reimposed multiple separate times across a war that stretched on for more than 5 months, with no clean, final resolution yet in sight. There's a genuinely important lesson buried in that fuller picture, one that applies well beyond just this specific conflict. Modern military campaigns against something as diffuse and asymmetric as a naval blockade rarely end with a single, decisive moment where the threat simply stops existing. Iran's blockade strategy relied on relatively cheap distributed assets, mines, small boats, coastal missile batteries, exactly the kind of asymmetric toolkit a militarily overmatched power reaches for, specifically because it's difficult to eliminate entirely, even against vastly superior conventional forces. You can destroy 16 mine layers in a single coordinated strike and still not have destroyed Iran's underlying capacity or willingness to keep trying, which is exactly what the late April order to keep sinking mine-laying boats confirms happened. That's not a failure of the original American campaign. Operation Project Freedom achieved exactly what it set out to achieve in the moment. It's simply an honest reflection of how difficult it is to permanently eliminate an asymmetric maritime threat through military force alone, without some kind of accompanying political or diplomatic resolution that actually addresses why Iran wanted to close the strait in the first place. It's also worth reflecting on what the entire episode reveals about the strategic value and the strategic risk of controlling a choke point like Hormuz in the first place. Iran's initial gambit, betting that closing the strait would generate enough global economic pressure to shift the terms of this conflict in its favor, produced real, serious disruption exactly as intended, but it also invited exactly the kind of overwhelming, targeted military response that eventually dismantled the physical infrastructure enforcing that closure. And the United States, having successfully broken Iran's blockade, then found itself reaching for the exact same tool, blockading Iranian shipping directly, not once but twice, suggesting that whatever side controls the stronger military position in this specific conflict, blockading the opposing side's maritime trade remains one of the most tempting and most frequently reached for tools available, regardless of how messy, costly, and difficult to sustain that tool actually proves to be in practice. What makes this entire saga worth understanding in this much detail, rather than just accepting the simple headline version of events, is that it's a genuinely clear illustration of the gap between a dramatic, well-executed military operation and a permanently resolved strategic outcome. The March 19th campaign against Iran's blockade infrastructure was real, effective, and genuinely impressive from a pure military execution standpoint, hitting exactly the right targets in exactly the right sequence to collapse a complex, multi-layered enemy operation. But that same campaign existed within a much longer, much messier war that kept producing new blockades, new casualties, and new rounds of escalation for months afterward, right up through this past week's reported strikes in the Gulf of Oman. Understanding both halves of that story, the genuine tactical success and the much murkier strategic aftermath, gives you a far more accurate picture of how this war has actually unfolded than either the triumphant early declarations or the more recent, grimmer headlines about Trump seeking an exit could provide entirely on their own. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Do you think Operation Project Freedom and the broader Strait of Hormuz campaign represented a genuine, decisive military success, even accounting for the fact that Iran kept attempting to mine the strait afterward, and the broader conflict has continued escalating and de-escalating for months since? Or do you think the persistence of the underlying conflict, multiple blockades, reimposed and lifted more than once, civilian casualties among neutral shipping, and continued enforcement actions as recently as this past week, undermines any claim that the blockade was ever truly, permanently shattered in the first place? And given that the United States ended up running its own blockade against Iran not once, but twice after breaking Iran's original closure of the strait, do you think that reflects a consistent, coherent strategic doctrine about controlling this specific waterway? Or do you think it reflects a war that's genuinely struggled to find any stable, lasting resolution, regardless of which side happens to hold the upper hand militarily at any given moment, cycling instead through the same basic playbook, blockade, counter-blockade, ceasefire, collapse, over and over across 5 months of fighting? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear how people are weighing the tactical successes against the much messier strategic picture here, because there's a real substantive argument on more than one side of it, and it's exactly the kind of question where the honest answer is genuinely somewhere in between the two extremes. There's a final point worth making about why stories like this one deserve careful, detailed treatment rather than getting reduced to a single triumphant headline. Wars involving control of critical maritime choke points rarely resolve as cleanly as the moment a specific military operation succeeds against a specific, defined objective. Operation Project Freedom genuinely did what it set out to do, and the personnel who planned and executed that campaign deserve real credit for a well-coordinated, effective piece of military strategy. But the broader war surrounding that single operation kept generating new crises, new blockades, and new casualties for months afterward, a pattern that's likely to keep repeating itself in some form until whatever underlying political dispute actually drove Iran to close the strait in the first place finds some kind of genuine, lasting resolution. Something that clearly still hasn't happened even now, months after that original March campaign supposedly settled the matter for good. If this breakdown helped you understand the full, complicated arc of the fight over the Strait of Hormuz instead of just the simplified headline version, share it with someone trying to follow this specific thread of the war. And subscribe if you want to keep tracking this as it develops. Because between the ongoing blockade enforcement, Trump's reported pivot towards sanctions, and the broader question of whether this war finds any genuine, lasting resolution, the story of who actually controls this waterway is clearly still being written 5 months and counting after the very first strikes that started this entire conflict. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment there's real movement to report.